For years, functional assessment in people with cerebral palsy has been based on clinical scales and subjective observation. These tools, although useful, have a clear limitation. They do not always reflect what is actually happening at the muscular level. And this is where a double problem arises, because on the one hand, errors can occur in classifying the patient's muscular condition, and on the other, training may be designed based on assumptions that do not correspond to their neuromuscular reality. So a key question arises that completely changes the approach. What if you could objectively measure which muscles are working, how they do so, and when they fail? Because at that moment you stop interpreting and start to understand what is really happening. And it is precisely here where surface electromyography, or EMG, comes into play, a tool that allows you to analyze the electrical activity of the muscle both at rest and during contraction, providing you with information that you simply can't obtain just by looking at the patient. It enables you to know if a muscle is overactive even when there is no movement, whether it is able to activate when required, or if there are significant differences between both sides of the body. This is especially important in people with cerebral palsy, where muscle patterns are often altered by phenomena such as spasticity, excessive coactivation, or low neuromuscular efficiency. To understand this better, let's look at a practical case. In an EMG analysis, patients with cerebral palsy were compared to healthy subjects by evaluating three key lower limb muscles, soleus, adductor magnus, and biceps femoris, in two very specific situations, at rest and during maximal isometric contraction. This not only allows us to see how much a muscle can be activated, but also how it behaves when it should be relaxed. And here we find the first major discovery, because at rest, patients with cerebral palsy showed elevated muscle activity on the affected side. In other words, the muscle is not truly relaxed when it should be. There's an increase in basal tone, which reflects spasticity or constant activation. And this has direct implications. The muscle becomes fatigued more quickly, uses more energy, and loses its ability to respond efficiently. But furthermore, this basal hyperactivity interferes with the ability to generate an effective voluntary contraction when movement requires it. The second finding is even more interesting, because when a maximum contraction is requested, something apparently contradictory happens. Those same muscles are activated less than in healthy individuals, which indicates that although the muscle is constantly switched on, it is not able to generate sufficient activation when it is really needed, reflecting low neuromuscular efficiency. And it is precisely the combination of both findings that defines one of the most characteristic patterns in cerebral palsy: higher basal activity together with a lower capacity for voluntary activation. That is to say, a muscle that works more than necessary but produces less than it should, which results in a loss of capacity to generate force efficiently, less power, poorer coordination, and a breakdown of symmetry between both sides of the body, affecting not only performance but also the risk of injury. Because an inefficient neuromuscular system is more vulnerable to loads, changes of direction, or unforeseen situations. Moreover, these alterations are not always visible to the naked eye, and here lies one of the major problems, as two patients may appear similar in a traditional clinical assessment, yet have completely different muscular behaviors, which explains why in some cases the functional classification does not truly reflect the patient's performance. And this is where EMG makes a difference, because it does not replace clinical judgment, but rather adds a layer of objective information that allows for a much more refined assessment. It helps you to identify hyperactivity at rest, deficits in activation during contraction, and significant asymmetries, enabling you to better understand the patient's neuromuscular profile and make much more precise decisions, moving from relying solely on what you see to supporting yourself with real data about what is happening inside the muscle. And when you understand that behavior, you can adapt the training in a much more specific way, working to reduce baseline hyperactivity, improve voluntary activation, and optimize coordination between muscle groups. Ultimately, in people with cerebral palsy, muscular alterations are not always obvious at first glance. A muscle may appear functional but be hyperactive at rest and inefficient during contraction, directly affecting performance, stability, and the risk of injury. An electromyography allows you to detect these alterations with precision and transform the way you assess, train, and make clinical decisions. Because in this context, it is not enough to simply observe movement. It is necessary to understand what is happening inside the muscle. So if you want to take that step, click Request Information and discover how to integrate EMG into your practice to assess objectively, adapt training, and move towards a fairer classification based on real data.